Hello, everyone. Welcome to the panel discussion happening in conjunction with the screening of The Uncertain Kingdom. My name is Shaza Ramli, Arts Programs Officer at British Council Malaysia. I am a female of Asian descent with black hair, and I am wearing a black top. With me today are my colleagues Florence Lambert, Head of Arts, and Erica Chung, Arts Manager, who will be moderating the chat. The Uncertain Kingdom is an extraordinary collection of short films offering a unique snapshot of the UK now. A selection of the films from the collection is currently showing online for free for a limited time. The themes explored in The Uncertain Kingdom span critical ongoing issues that affect people on a global scale. This panel discussion aims to provide a platform for discourse on some of these themes, drawing parallels between the UK and Malaysia on social issues that are prevalent in both societies. We hope to encourage dialogue to raise awareness of these issues and to explore ways of bridging the gap towards a more inclusive and cohesive society. For more information on the films and this program, please click the link in the chat. In this event, the panel discussion will take about 30 minutes, followed by a Q&A session with the audience. Before we begin, I'd like to announce some house rules. Sign language interpretation is available throughout the event. All attendees' audio and video will be disabled during the discussion, and audio will be enabled during the Q&A. During the Q&A, if you would like to speak or ask a question, please indicate in the chat or use the raise hand function. And once called upon, please unmute your mic to speak. We welcome your comments and questions in the chat throughout the event. This event is recorded and will be published on the British Council website. By attending, you acknowledge that your comments may be recorded and rebroadcast. And lastly, let's be kind to each other during the event. I'm delighted to introduce our speakers today. Moderating the discussion is Nadia Denton, who has worked in the UK film industry for 15 years as impact producer, curator, and author. She specializes in Nigerian cinema and coined the term Beyond Nollywood. Nadia will be speaking with Badrul Hisham Ismail and Deborah Germaine Augustin. Badrul is a writer and filmmaker based in Malaysia. His films have been featured in a number of international film festivals. He is also the founder and content editor of Suara, a Malay language periodical journal on art, culture, and society. He is the director of programs at Iman Research, a local think tank focusing on socio-political and security matters. Also joining the conversation is Deborah, who is a writer born and raised in Malaysia. She is the membership engagement manager and Malaysia lead at New Narrative, an online journalism platform and independent media outlet that publishes content on Southeast Asian current affairs. Without further ado, I'd now like to welcome the speakers to kickstart the discussion.
Thank you, Siaza. I'm Nadia, a female of African descent with Afro hair. Today, I'm wearing red earrings and a brightly colored necklace. I identify as she and her. Really delighted to be hosting this international conversation between the UK and Malaysia. Looking forward to the positive engagement that I'm sure is to follow from my guests, Badrul and Deborah. Before we kick off the discussion, I just wanted to let those of you in the audience who are watching know that there will be time for questions, as been mentioned later on in the discussion. At this point, we ask that you either raise your hand to indicate that you want to put a point forward, or to drop a comment in the chat. So, Deborah, just starting off in terms of the conversation around the films that are presented in the Uncertain Kingdom programme. It's notable that many of them deal with social issues, from homelessness to mental health. And if we kind of look at trends in the film industry more broadly, it's been reported that during the COVID-19 pandemic, there's been increased documentary watching by audiences worldwide. I wondered if you thought that this means that the pandemic, I wonder what your thoughts were about whether the pandemic has made audiences more sensitized to social issue-led films.
Hi, Nadia. Everybody, I'm Deborah, and my pronouns are she, her. I have shoulder-length black hair, and I'm wearing a black top. I think, I think the pandemic has made everyone a little bit more sensitized to inequality in general, because I think, it's a global event that we're all experiencing, but I think we're all experiencing it very differently, and it really depends on your resources. Can you afford to stay at home? Or does your work require you to go in and you can't quarantine or self-isolate and sort of stay safe? That was the initial phrase, stay home, stay safe, but not everyone can stay home, and not everyone is safe at home as well. So I think, people were slowly having to reflect on the fact that actually, we live in a very unequal society wherever you are. So I think that maybe has pushed people to think about social issues more and want to learn more about things. And so, yeah, I think that definitely has been more of an interest in documentaries in general, and maybe, yeah, and in portrayals of social issues. I think that's safe to say.
And Badrul, a lot of your work deals with social commentary, reflections from an artistic point of view on societal issues. I wonder what your own view was about whether audiences are now more sensitized to watching social issue projections on screen.
Hi, thank you, Nadia. I'm Badrul. I have short hair, wear glasses, and I wear gray t-shirt. So to your question, I think tragic events do make people seek out input and also output if they can, so that they can reflect on what's going on around them. And I remember in Malaysia, at least, more than 20 years ago, during the financial crisis and the Asian financial crisis and the reformasi period, there were a lot of activities that sort of came out of it. People looking for study groups, people looking for people reading the news paper and watching the news more often. So looking for inputs and looking for things that they can use to sort of make sense of what's going on around them. And what is more unique in this period that we're dealing with right now is you don't have the privilege of going out and talking to your friends and talking to the people that you know about what's going on. So you rely on online content, and which makes full sense that people are seeking out more documentaries or any kind of films and information.
And in terms of your own creative practice, Badrul, I'm just curious as to whether during this time you have reflected differently in terms of the kind of content you think you're going to make henceforth. How has the pandemic affected you as an artist and filmmaker?
Well, unfortunately, I didn't really had a time to really sit down and think about it, and I don't really have a really good answer on that. But the thing was that when the pandemic happened, we didn't know how long it was going to last. So there were things that we were doing just to react on something that we thought was just going to be a very short period. Specifically talking about one of the edition of the journal that we published last year, we were talking specifically about the pandemic, and we thought it was going to end already by then, but clearly not. So it was more reacting to what's going on rather than having a really thought out process and having a really thought out output.
And certainly, Badrul, you've mentioned the extent to which a lot of us are much more online because of the limited opportunities to meet face to face. I certainly feel like, online programming is here to stay in a way that wasn't really conceivable before the pandemic. And certainly, this program that we're, talking about and engaging with online would have probably happened in person, you know, pre-pandemic. I feel that with online, and certainly I think a lot of us in the industry have seen, we can engage much broader and international audiences for these kind of programs, and that's definitely one of the strong attractions. What has been your own experience, Deborah, of engaging with film programs online? And what would you say, thinking about that, makes this selection of shorts from the Uncertain Kingdom program different?
I think I've experienced a lot of theater and dance online now, I think, and that's been a very new experience. I have actually attended a film festival as well online, and you know, I think it's interesting to see how people are adapting performance and art in general for an online viewing experience. You know, sometimes for theater in Malaysia, the practice has been they'll own, like, you have to watch it, say at 6 p.m. And you know, it's not like you can get a recording that you can watch whenever you want. So they try to replicate that experience of being in the theater, and or like this, they have, you know, given you a link that's available for a limited time, and then you can watch it. One of the fun things has been watching it with friends, like saying, you know, let's do this together. Let's watch this film or this performance online together, and then we get to talk about it. And I think that's really the best part about it. And yes, you know, you can watch it with a friend overseas. Like I asked a friend who is in the UK, I said, you know, why don't you watch some of these movies with me, and we can talk about them. And so I think it has allowed for connection at a time, like Badrul said, when we, I think, have more limited connection with each other, or, you know, for whatever reason, we, you know, we just might not be able to see friends and family anymore. So I think this experience of watching something together and then being able to connect over it is really meaningful. And yeah, I mean, I think art is always a great way to try and connect with others. So I think that's been a nice experience of the pandemic.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with what you said, Deborah. I mean, I'm thinking about, you know, other art forms, you know, like theatre and dance. I have been able to watch, you know, festivals and, you know, events that probably I wouldn't have attended in person. And I think what's been quite interesting is seeing how those creatives or disciplines where they've been able to take a kind of multi-art approach have really been able to produce some of the most exciting and dynamic, you know, online programs. So you have a mixture of live performance recorded in a socially distanced way. You have different speakers from, you know, across the globe. And then they're able also to sort of integrate like clips of pre-recorded content in archives. So for all of its sort of limitations of, you know, being in the online world and not being as engaged with people face to face, it's definitely thrown up a lot of benefits. And I think this particular program, you know, The Uncertain Kingdom, that opportunity to watch these films on demand, you know, in this way, and to access this kind of Q&A, you know, internationally, is just one of the probably highlights, you know, and new ways of working that, you know, as a film industry and as creatives, we now have the opportunity to kind of shape into our particular ways of working. Badrul, I'm curious to know what you think makes this Uncertain Kingdom program perhaps different from some of the other online programs that you've engaged with.
Well, definitely the multinational aspect, and being able to still stay in your own country and getting involved with the program. The accessibility aspect, of course, which is for a film is kind of a smooth transition, I would say, because, you know, people are watching films on their computers anyway, and this is just a matter of watching it in the cinema and watching by yourself at home, and having the option to do that. It was kind of simple, smooth transition, which is something that, interestingly, for example, like sports have been doing it for a very long time. They have live sports, but at the same time, people can still watch that live competition, you know, from other parts of the world without having to, you know, deal with the logistics and the expenditure of going to these places, you can still watch them, which is something that I would prefer it to stay, so that we can have different levels of engagement, and like you said, sort of broadening the inclusivity aspect of it.
And at this point, I wanted to get your critiques on some of the specific films. So I wondered what your views were about film as a form, dealing with difficult issues socially. So we've kind of talked a bit about the fact that, these films broadly cover social issues, but I'm wanting to sort of further interrogate your views about film as a form, dealing with things that at times can be difficult to talk about. So in terms of the films that are in the program, I'm thinking about Swan, which uses satire in a very tongue-in-cheek way, and as a metaphor to discuss nationalism. And also, for instance, The Life Tree, which has elements of magical realism. It's a devastating piece about social and economic inequality, but it uses this realism in a way which enables us to have a bit more identification with the lead protagonist. So, Deborah, I'm wondering if you could share some of your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting that all the films, well, not all, but many of them have this aspect of the surreal in them. I think the conversation, it starts out grounded in reality, and then we sort of move into one of the characters, sort of perhaps a fantasy, or his like a stream of consciousness represented in a dance form, which was something I really had never really seen in a film before. And yeah, the Swan is a satire, and I really liked the Swan. I think that's my favorite of all the films, because I think that so often, I think when we talk about racism or prejudice, we tend to focus on the person experiencing the oppression or the minority. But the Swan is great because it focuses on the absurdity of the person in the majority who has the power to oppress, and the kind of lengths that someone in the majority will go to kind of maintain their worldview that upholds the status quo, and even to their detriment, which I think the film really illustrates in this very funny way. And yeah, I thought it was great because I think that's actually not a perspective we see that often. I think the default way to talk about oppression is to think about how the person who's being oppressed experiences the oppression. And I think that's important. It's important to represent that. But I think that in doing that, we forget that we should also be interrogating the way that the people with power, their way of thinking and how, they are affected by it too. And I think that's an important part. So, and I think satire is a really great way to open up that conversation, because, I think there's a realist way to have gone about that subject matter, but I think it might not have been as effective. I really think that using satire and absurdity, it really it brings home the message, because I've actually been thinking about the film ever since I saw it. So yeah, I think in a way it was more effective done as a comedy and with satire. Yeah.
Badrul?
Yeah, I mean, people create fiction because they don't know how to have those conversations in real life. And I mean, risking to sound very pretentious, I watch films to get those things, to learn about things that not close to me, and that's why I've loved film since I was a kid. So, and I think and like you were saying, the idea of using either satire, to using surreal aspect. The whole idea is to play around with the medium, to play around with what film can do in real life you can't do, but to sort of have the difficult conversations that we need to have, right? Yeah.
And certainly the conversation, which is one of the shorts in the selection, had a unique narrative in the way that it used dance to probe conversations about race and discrimination, which were kind of sort of touched on in terms of our references to Swan. I wondered what your own personal reflections were on the film and how you see the themes relating to present-day Malaysian society. So, Badrul, yes,
okay.
that would be great.
Well, it came in a surprise. I didn't know that the film will become a dance routine. I mean, because we just look at the title and then it starts with people sitting at a table at a restaurant. So I thought it's just going to be like a straight up conversation. But to having that kind of fresh approach to having a conversation is kind of interesting. And for me, just to look at how people are, the ability of those dancers to, I mean, the physical ability of the dancers itself. I mean, I always admire people who can, physically do things that regular people can't do, like myself. And having it in a way sort of to bring in this kind of topic is, I guess, put more meaning into what they're trying to do rather than just dance for dance sake. And in terms of discrimination here in Malaysia, I mean, I think we have pretty much the same problem that we have in many countries that are dealing with, people with different backgrounds, people with different cultures and tradition. Something that we are very, how should I say this? I mean, we are struggling to learn. We are struggling to just understand the level of discrimination that happens, either prejudice on racial ethnicity or religious belief, which unfortunately is something that still kind of a sensitive topic to discuss openly, which is why things like work of art would be very useful to sort of spur this kind of discussion, because what we want to see is not people talk about it right after they saw the film, but maybe 3 days, 3 months ahead, they remember the film and they can still talk about it.
And Deborah, just touching on Badrul's point about the fact of some of these issues around race and discrimination being difficult to talk about in the society, why do you think that it's like that?
Well, many reasons. I think that in Malaysia, we are still trying to find language to talk about race in the first place. I think, yeah, it was an interesting movie for me because I'm mixed race myself, and I think sometimes people think that being in a mixed race relationship makes you more progressive or something like that, which the film explores that one of the partners is white, and by claiming that she's not like the other people who are racist, she is actually more like them than she realizes. And so I think one of that is just like we don't have the language really, and two, I think it's I mean, legally it can be risky in Malaysia to speak about these issues. I mean, we still have the Sedition Act in Malaysia, a present from the British. Maybe I shouldn't say that here, but we are still grappling with, you can be investigated for sedition for talking about, quote unquote sensitive issues, which are which race and religion fall under. So people are very afraid to speak about these things because there can be real legal repercussions to saying, bringing that up. And I think we really do have the, Malay privileges are entrenched legally in the country, institutionally. And so, I think people do feel quite uncomfortable trying to speak openly about that. I mean, I'll be real. I'm thinking very carefully about how I'm phrasing this right now myself. So,
well, this is a safe space, and at times as creatives and artists, we've got to touch controversy. If we can't do it, as working in the arts, who else is going to do it?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think I have been wondering this, because as this conversation of racial privilege becomes more global, I mean, I think the model a lot of people use is the US, where, concepts of things like white privilege exist. And sometimes people try to apply it to Malaysia, and then people here will say, well, you can't compare it to America, even though there might be some parallels. So I've really been thinking, like, what is the language we can use to develop, our own way of discussing race and racial privilege and that kind of thing. But yeah, I mean, there's certainly, like, I think there's a limited language, and also there is like sort of a legal and cultural aspect where these things feel like you really can't touch them.
Yeah, but I mean, I certainly identify with what you're saying about the language, because, in certain parts of the world, of course, that concept of white privilege doesn't apply if you have a country that's dominated by a particular race. So, for instance, I'm active in the Nigeria space. Their issues are much more to do with like tribalism, so differences between ethnic groups, and also shadism, colorism. So there are a lot of nuances when we do sort of delve into these conversations about discrimination and racism, and how that sort of works itself out in different parts of the world, particularly where there has been a colonial legacy, like you rightfully point out, Deborah. And how it kind of creeps into even our modern day conversations. But speaking of the colonial legacy, my sort of two personal favorites in terms of the selection were Motherland, which deals with issues to do with immigration, particularly for people who are from the West Indies. I related to that because my grandparents were of the Windrush generation. They came here in the 50s and, tried to, or worked to, build this country up. And so that devastating act where the Home Office, effectively shipped people back, or sort of said because they didn't have the right documentation, they had to, return to the Caribbean, was definitely very jarring, watching those testimonies. But I also particularly was touched by What's in a Name. As I've mentioned earlier, my name is Nadia, and, growing up, I can relate to the experience of having a name which isn't Western European, or, has sort of different cultural meanings across the world and pronounced in different ways. I wondered which films you especially related to and why.
The movie about the name was interesting because it's like I've had the reverse experience where, like, my name is very Anglo in Malaysia, and so it's often the name that people can't pronounce here. So so it was interesting to watch my experience reflected in that, even though it was a different context of that. Of people who are who have non-Western names in a Western society. But yeah, I think that still, it had some resonance for me because it was about, finding pride in your name. And that's something that I've had to do as well, wishing, oh, why isn't it just easier for people to say my name? And so, yeah, I found that very moving. And I mean, for me, it really is Swan, because I think that was such a clever take on oppression that I think we just don't do enough. And I think that, as a piece of art, I think, yeah, that I really liked that a lot. So yeah, those were my two favorites.
And what about you, Badrul?
Well, in terms of name, interestingly, my name is actually grammatically wrong because it's a Malayanized Arab name. So the way it has an Arab meaning if it's in full, but when you separate the first, second, and third name, the second name, Badrul, basically doesn't really mean, it's grammatically wrong. So it's kind of interesting how, not really oppression, but how certain culture that we inherit, it doesn't really translate well when put it in local context. But I don't really have any much problem with that anymore, I guess. But interesting when you said motherland for me, which is also something that personally I have some personal thoughts on it as well, because I come from binational family. My late mother was Indonesian. So I remember her having to deal with the immigration. It took her a while to finally became a Malaysian citizen. The whole process took like decades. And now with COVID, I have a whole family in other part. I mean, in Indonesia that I sort of cannot see. I don't know when we can see, when I can see them. So the whole isolation, just because we identify ourselves with our national border, and we deal with our political issue through national lens. For example, like right now, COVID, we're only looking in our own country, right? We don't really look at the pandemic as a whole global issue that we all need to deal with together. And our measure that we take to control it has a lot of social effect on it. It separates families, separates loved ones, and all that. And so I mean, that film really sort of brought home that kind of issue, where we are sort of still stuck in this national lens that I think with this globalized world, we really should look into different ways of identifying ourselves while still keeping local community safe and secure.
Thanks, Badrul. So we've now entered the Q&A phase, so to speak. We're at the point in the conversation where I'd warmly welcome comments and questions from members of the audience who want to either ask about the films or comment on things that they saw that they wanted to share with the group. We've already had 2 comments through. So Ikram flagged the fact that he really liked The Pavement, and that it really resonated with him quite strongly, and he found it to be a beautiful piece of work. And there was also a question about which of the films you both preferred and why, which we've kind of touched on. So audience members, I would encourage you at this point to raise your hands and to step forward. So we've got Munira, who's put their hand up. So Munira, if you could disable your mute and proceed with your comment or question.
Okay, I finally unmuted myself. Sorry for the delay.
That's okay.
Unfortunately, I cannot show my camera is not working. Anyway, I'm Munira. I'm a Malaysian. So before I ask my question, I would just like to preface that I unfortunately only had the opportunity to watch 3 of the films, and of which the conversation resonated very closely with me. I'm a Malaysian of an Indian descent, and I'm also a Muslim, and I'm also a woman. That's like the triple crown for marginalization, I suppose, especially here in Malaysia. And I'm also aware that it doesn't help that the legal constitution and the social norms in this country, though the people do not intend to do so, the product of colonialism or even modern day politics do divide people. So my question is towards the panel, and of course, particularly the Malaysian filmmakers here, Mr. Badrul and Deborah. What do you think about the conversation, in the sense that when we watched the conversation, of course, there was a massive part of it was the pain, the experience, the horrors of racism, colorism being translated and transmuted in the form of a dance. But towards the end, you have the idea what it's all about. The repeated reassurance of people who are the majority that, you know what, things would change a few years down the line. It's not always like that. It's just you in your mind. But at the end of the day, they are not being subjected to a second-class citizen. And I must also say, Nadia, that I am very much aware as a brown person, of course, my experience might not be as the same level of the subjugation that the African people have experienced in African American communities or British Africans as such. But at the end of the day, do you think, the Malaysian filmmakers, that the cognizance that the director delivered towards the end of the conversation Can that cognizance be achieved in our film industry or through our community? Yes, sorry for that very long-winded question.
No, that's great, Munira. Thank you. We appreciate the engagement.
I think, I feel some mixed feelings about the conversation as a film. I think because I wanted, I think, a bit more grounding in reality of the main character's experience. I think sometimes, yeah, I think I wanted the dance sequence personally to be a bit shorter, and I think I wanted to go back into reality and see him interact with his partner a bit more. And I do think it was powerful to see the room of people and realize this is happening all around you. But I'm personally not a fan of using intimate relationships as the vehicle to talk about racism. I think that it's done here in Malaysia as well. I think a very famous film is Sepet, which is about a Malay girl and a Chinese boy. It's an inter-religious and racial relationship, and they eventually overcome the obstacles of being from different ethnicities and religions to be together. But then they don't end up together. I won't spoil the film in case anyone hasn't seen it. But yeah, they don't end up together. And so, that for me, it just, there's no progress in that film. Like it's a, and as I said earlier, interracial relationships, I think, are seen as more progressive, but I think that people in interracial relationships can still, as the film shows, still be very biased and bigoted and not really have done the work to overcome their internal biases. So I think I have some mixed feelings about that film because I just really think that at the end of the day, racism is much bigger than your interpersonal relationships, and I think that often it's the nature of storytelling that we want to tell it through a very personal lens, so relationships become the focus. But I think that, to me, that isn't really the most effective way. And I think even if we do have a story about an interracial relationship, I think where, I don't know, one partner eventually realizes their biases, I don't know how far that really takes us. So that's yeah, I have some mixed feelings about the conversation. So yeah, that's my take on it.
Okay. I agree a lot with what Deborah was saying. I guess there's a personal relationship between people with different ethnicity or race, and then there's the relationship between people in the state. And I think these are really, really different relationship, and it has really different effect as well. And we need to be able to look at them differently to basically solve them, because I do think that they require different solutions. Even the way of talking about it also has to be different. And in terms of Malaysia, I mean, I'm not really a race relation expert, but I mean, we do know that there's a lot of there's a huge intercultural, ethnicity, interracial issue that we have here in Malaysia, and well, first I think we need to understand. I mean, not really understand. We need to sort of like I said, I'm trying to be more articulate here. Like what I was saying earlier, there's the personal relationship that we can nurture, that we can help solve, and that films like Sepet and films like The Conversation is really touching on. But then there's also the institutionalized state culture that is, you can barely touch it in terms of how we can work around it in personal films, in personal stories. Yeah, that's all I can say for now.
I mean, thank you for that question, Minera, which I think kind of probes, it kind of pushes some of the earlier points that were made about race and discrimination and, you know, the lack of language, etc., a bit further down. I mean, I do echo some of your sentiments, Deborah, about the conversation in terms of those sort of, you expressed your wish for it to be a bit more concrete. And I did find, I did, as I was watching, I did question whether the fact that it was so abstract meant that maybe some of the messaging was lost. But then the flip side of that was the reality that, you know, when you're thinking about these issues in terms of race discrimination, however you want to term it, it is abstract and there are so many different interpretations. And so as I was watching, I thought to myself, well, actually, you know, you can look at any given situation and see that actually, whichever vantage point a given person's standing from, they feel that their own point has validity. And in fact, you know, a lot of the things that happen to people day to day where they may feel that they're discriminated against or been treated differently is down to some level of, you know, subjectivity. So yeah, I did sort of reflect quite a bit, and I do agree that it was interesting, the director's choice of using that personal relationship at the beginning, and then it suddenly goes into dance. But I suppose that's also what made it kind of quirky. But Manera, one of the comments that I wanted to make in relation to your question is, I suppose I've myself, you know, as a curator and a creative, have been reflecting on, you know, what opportunities has this pandemic posed, you know, for those of us in the creative community? Because clearly it's robbed a lot of us in many ways, but it's also presented new things. And I think this whole point we collectively touched on about language is a really interesting one, you know, how we frame some of these conversations, particularly in this new age where, you know, the pandemic has pushed along a lot of conversations there were about how we could interact with technology, AI, you know, just basically interacting in a very different way. I'm very curious and excited, I suppose, on some levels to see how creatives are going to use language, use forms like film, use technology to kind of deal with these issues. But I'm conscious that we have got just under 15 minutes left, and
Can I just
really
add
would
a
like to
little
welcome.
bit? Are you okay?
Yes,
Just
yes,
just
please
to
do.
make what I was saying a little bit clearer. Well, I think there's a difference between wanting a person or ourselves to be accepted by people who are different from us, and wanting the state to treat us the same as every citizens. And the issue with focusing on personal relationship is, yeah, you might get people who would, and in the end, treat you the same, the way you want to be treated. But as a citizen, you still treated as a second-class citizen, which most stories about or film or, you know, literature about inter-ethnic relationship that, you know, focus on personal relationship doesn't really deal with. Yeah, so that's.
Yeah, you're very right. It's true. And I suppose perhaps some of that's tied into the point that Deborah made about sedition earlier on. Perhaps creatives and filmmakers being afraid of how far they can sort of stretch the margins of the conversation without drawing, you know, some harmful attention from the authorities or from the state. But I just wanted to remind audience members that you now have the floor, so to speak, to make comments and to ask questions. So please don't be shy. I welcome you to put your comments or questions in the chat if there was anything burning or pressing that you particularly wanted to ask or to say. So do we have anyone? Okay, well, I still have some more questions, so I will keep an eye out on the chat if any of you do put your points forward. But in this sort of closing last 10 to 15 minutes, I wanted to also discuss the presentation of disability. So I felt watching Verisimilitude, I always have trouble pronouncing that one, that it reflected the fact that there's still some taboo about presenting disability on screen. So, you know, there was a scene in the film where the protagonist quite eloquently laments her experience as someone who's born with a disability versus someone who has maybe an accident or becomes disabled later in life. And it kind of just made me think about the sort of experience of a disabled person, particularly if they have a obvious or more physical impairment, about what that means when you're growing up with it versus if it hits you later in life. I wanted to ask you both about how these issues are perceived by Malaysian society and what considerations are made to include disabled communities in terms of accessing economic, social and cultural life. So based on your own experiences, you know, does the arts in Malaysia play a role in raising awareness on disability?
I would say that it really doesn't. I would say in terms of really understanding that um, we should, you know, try and we have to do things differently if we want to include disabled persons. I think there really is very low awareness about that in Malaysia. I remember I organized an event for work, and we made a point to say, you know, we have been offered a bigger venue, but it will not be accessible to anyone in a wheelchair. It will be in a space that you have to go upstairs. There is no accessibility. So if that will mean the event's not accessible to you, please let us know, and we won't shift the event to the different venue. Or we would sometimes say we are in a venue that is not accessible to people with with a wheelchair, and that's a very unusual practice in Malaysia. So I think it's still not something that people realize that is needed to make an event accessible to everybody. The fact that this event has sign language interpretation is unusual in Malaysia, I would say, and that we did try to describe ourselves visually is also, it's not common practice in Malaysia. So I think there's lots of room for us to improve and to do better in terms of how we include people, and to give space to disabled people to tell their own stories, because I think that's always very important. I think that I always think of this quote by the Indian writer Arundhati Roy, which is that no one is silent, people are silenced. So I think I'm paraphrasing it, but yes, I think, basically everyone can tell their own story. So it's really about the rest of us to just step back and give space.
I agree with all of those sentiments. Badrul?
Yeah, I think culturally in Malaysia and maybe other countries as well, we tend to look at the disabled community as people that we need to take care of, rather than people who we would want to be able to live independently and empowered. So anything that relates to policies and practices of either including or not even including disabled community have always been throughout that lens, where we help them to do things rather than allow them to be to have their own life independently. But in terms of the local film, I think it depends on the lobby group, I would say, because a couple of years back there was a series of film that touch on issues specifically on autism, and because there's a huge group behind it that is really pushing for awareness of this issue, and one of it was at least a couple of films that I know of in different languages also, to sort of create more awareness of this. Unfortunately, there aren't that many other types of lobby groups, not even talking about the disabled community, but any kind of other social concerns. Luckily luckily or not, but for the autistic NGO, they really had a lot of funding behind them, and they were able to lobby filmmakers to write and make films that touch on those issues. But without that kind of support, without that kind of ability, then there's no kind of effort to create that kind of awareness at all. very barely, I'd say.
Well, so touching on this sort of area of discourse, I've got a question from audience member Danielle Azar. So Danielle has asked, what are examples of effective measures currently in place or feasible enough to be implemented to address better representation of disabilities, ethnic minorities, LGBTQ plus mental health issues in the Malaysian and British film industries? So I wondered, Deborah and Badrul, if you could sort of chew off that question, so to speak. And the second part of the question is, do you foresee better representation as achievable in popular cinema? Or what could work in you know, the indie film scene in light of pressures from, you know, commerciality from studios and academia, etc.?
I think that, you know, with films, I think, you know, actors traditionally, you know, they, as you see in the film verisimilitude, also a hard word for me, in that film, they have someone who's not disabled playing a disabled character that is, you know, part of the film, where a disabled person is watching an actor who isn't disabled, you know, lose weight and, you know, learn how to use a wheelchair to play a character who has a disability. And I think we're now seeing in Hollywood, for example, a conversation that if the character has a disability, it should be played by a disabled actor. And I think that that's maybe something in Malaysia we should look towards doing, rather than getting people to, you know, play act basically that they have a disability, but to actually ask, you know, in the community, is there somebody who could play that part? So I think that would be definitely feasible when it comes to representation. And I don't think it's all that radical, really, to ask somebody who has that experience to act the part in a movie. So I think that's very feasible. And, you know, I think that's just a mindset change rather than a policy change. And I think in terms of representation in the indie versus commercial, I mean, I think you do have more freedom if you're trying to make an independent film, maybe, versus a commercial film. But I think that, you know, sometimes commercial things can surprise you. My friends and I all got into this Malay drama. Badrul, his face. My friends earlier this year on Netflix, it's called Noor, which is
I know.
Yeah,
I
so
know
I
of
think
it.
yeah, it was very, very popular on TV, and it's like it's a commercial TV show, and it's about a religious teacher who falls in love with a sex worker, and it's, you know, it's about who deserves to be religious, or, you know, who deserves to have faith, and, you know, how we should treat people who don't appear holy. I think it's actually quite a radical TV show by Malaysian standards, and in some ways quite progressive. Like, there is a trans actress on the TV show, and nothing is ever remarked upon about her transness, or like, yeah, it's you know, sometimes she will say like, oh yeah, religious people don't ever care about me, you know, like they don't think I deserve to be close to God. But that's, yeah, I was really surprised that this mainstream Malay TV show had a trans actress in it, and, you know, she was just like any other character. And they used the term sex worker in that show instead of, um, they said pekerja sex or sex worker rather than pelacur, which is like the pejorative term. So, you know, it was it it's possible. I'm like, it wasn't made that long ago. So yeah, I mean, it's very melodramatic and a bit over the top, but I think that it had very progressive messages, and it was like a commercial TV show, and it from what I've heard, it was very, very popular. Like like my Malay friends were like, "Oh yeah, my family was all watching this at Eid." Like, the finale was like, I think, near Eid, and everybody was glued to their TV watching it.
Wow.
So yeah,
We're now in the last final minutes. As much as I would love to extend this conversation, it's always the way where it starts to get more controversial and exciting towards the end of the event. But Badrul, I just wanted to give you a minute to respond both to Deborah's points and that broad question that Danielle put out.
Well, in terms of representation in Malaysia, Malaysia is a kind of a unique place where we have a lot of celebrities who are kind of ambiguous in their sexual identity and orientation. People like Jafar On, people like Azwana Jali, even Yasmin Ahmad, the director who made Sepet, the film that Deborah mentioned. She's trans. She was trans. So in a way, there's some level of acceptance when for the audience to have, not necessarily people who fall into very specific category of individuals, to be a celebrity, to be a famous director or actor or TV presenter and all that. But the issue for me always comes where before the film was even made or before the TV show was even made, the idea of self-censorship, and not only because of taboo subject, also because of the sort of the economy of scale. You want a broader base of audience so that you can, recoup your expenses, make money, make profit. So just a short statement to help better representation, I would say we need a different economic model that we don't rely on just the economic scale to create creative work.
That's amazing. And I think such a great point to end on. I mean, I would love to talk with you further, and it is a shame that we've run out of time. But I think from that last point or question, what I've taken away from your responses is that indeed there's perhaps a bit more space or room for creatives to develop narratives that push the boundaries. And indeed, audiences are probably ahead of the gatekeepers and even people in government or the state who would like to impose certain boundaries or make, the wider society feel that there's only certain types of conversations that can be discussed or points of view that can be put forward in spaces, and to maybe give us this impression that we have to feel like, concerned, or we have to kind of be like, oh, well, if I put, this kind of controversial character, maybe if they are disabled and they have a limb missing or whatever, audiences are not going to like it. Actually, people, are much more receptive. Now, as we close, in addition to thanking you both, Deborah and Badrul, for giving us your time and sharing your insights, I would also like to remind audience members that we have got a survey which we'd be very grateful if you could complete. It's really helpful to get feedback to enable us to put these kind of events on and to sort of feed them into plans for future events that the team might be thinking of. I also wanted to, I'm mindful that we haven't had as much time as we would have liked to extend the conversation. So please, I would encourage you to follow, whether it be myself, Badrul, or Deborah on social media, or reach out to us online. We'd be more than happy to receive messages from you and to be in touch. But yeah, that pretty much brings us to a close. Those of you who are in attendance who've started to watch the films, you're very welcome to spread the word and please tell people about the program. This recorded conversation will be online for people to watch, but also the films are available until I believe the 10th of October. But on that note, I am going to hand over to my colleague Shiaza.
Thank you very much, Nadia, Deborah, and Badrul, for very stimulating conversation. And thank you everyone for attending and participating today. So we really hope this has been a valuable discussion for everyone. And as Nadia has mentioned, we'd be really grateful if you could spare 2 minutes to complete the survey in the chat. And The Uncertain Kingdom is still showing until next weekend. And if you haven't already, please do have a watch and share the screening with your family and friends, colleagues. The British Council will be hosting an event in November called Partner Southeast Asia. The event will be aiming to highlight arts and culture in the region and to also deepen engagement between Southeast Asia and the UK. So watch out for news on this event as well as other British Council events and opportunities by following us on social media. And links to these are in the chat. We also welcome inquiries for collaboration. So please contact us via the email in the chat. So thank you very much, everybody, for the session today. Have a good weekend.